Sorry, my name is Toshiko Kauda. I'm teaching at SAIS and also affiliate to Russia Center and SAIS faculty. And unfortunately, Russia Center's ringmaster, Kent Kauda, had some schedule conflict. He is chairing a faculty lunch right now. So he asked me to be an introducer of today's speaker, Victoria Kim. And I'm sure some of you know Victoria already. You're familiar with Victoria? Yes, right. But no surprise, but because she is alumni of SAIS, and she majored in Korean studies here several years ago. And she also obtained MA from Bolton University in international journalism. And also, we have fortunate to have her work with us as a Reischauer Center researcher several years ago. And so it's so nice to have Victoria here with us. And actually, she has, as you know, she has been pursuing one very important issue, maybe throughout her life, I believe, which is very much related to her own identity. And I'm sure a lot of you heard about the Koryo Saram, Korean diaspora lived in former Soviet Union. And those people actually started to live where history goes back to the 19th century, late 19th century to early 20th century, up to World War II. But anyway, a lot of Korean, ethnic Koreans started to live across the so-called current border, Tuman River, of Korea and Russia. And they started to live in Russian territory. And their number came up pretty high. 200,000 or something like that?
Yeah, originally almost 200,000 were deported. And now there are like over 500,000 people basically.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
okay.
Of ethnic Korean origin living in the former Soviet Union.
Okay. So that's the number. And anyway, so when actually, this is that we are talking about the era of Stalin's Great Terror. And in 1937, Stalin made a big decision to deport all those Korean ethnic people who are living, ethnic Korean living in, at that time, Far East Russia, to all move into Central Asia. Basically Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and several other areas. And the day he ordered, all of a sudden ordered a deportation of altogether, like you said, 200,000 people living from the Far East to the Central Asia. The travel was a very severe one, putting down a lot of people, families packed in a cattle car. That's what we heard. And a long, severe trip to the Central Asia. During the travel, many people lost lives, and their family gets separated and lots of things. But finally, those who made the trip ended up living in Central Asia and raised their family, intermarriage, and they are continuously living there. Of course, some intermarried and spread into other parts of the Soviet Union. And actually, so, and the Kim's, Victoria's grandfather used to be one of the first, one of the deportees. And I believe I heard that you always grown up, when you were growing up, your grandfather always told how harsh the train trip, when he was young. And this is her, research topic throughout her life for pursuing her identity. And she made a wonderful documentary called Lost and Found in Uzbekistan. You may know already. And she came here last year and 2 years ago?
2 years ago and last year. So this is the third or fourth
exactly.
seminar on the topic.
Right,
so
right.
it's a sequel, we can call it.
Yes.
Now dedicated to North Korea.
Right. And yes, exactly. Each time I heard her story was fascinating. But anyway, this time she is talking about the relationship of the role of those Korean diaspora in a former Soviet Union during the time of the formation of the North Korea. So it's a fascinating topic, and especially a lot of us heard yesterday, James Parsons talk about the history of North Korean diplomat and politics. And he is coming here very soon, joining us, and as a commentator. And so I hope he comes here soon. But anyway, after Victoria will give a talk, and then James will give some comment. Hopefully, you can exchange whatever views. And after that, we'll pick up questions from you.
Yeah.
That will be the procedure. So, shall we start?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Toshiko-san. Hello, everyone. So good to see so many people here today. Wonderful audience of students and professionals. And I'm very grateful to the Reischauer Center, to Johns Hopkins Science, and to Reischauer Center, and Dr. Calder, and Toshiko Calder, and all the professors and staff, of course, for supporting my research and helping always to organize and promote these events and these talks or seminars that I've been giving since 2016. So I'll very briefly mention my projects for those who are not very familiar, because I see a lot of new people. I was actually thinking maybe there will be people from the last year and the year before, which I think there are, but there are also a lot of new people. So indeed, as Dr. Toshiko Calder has mentioned, I've been working I think over the last 6 years at least on the topics of the overseas Korean diasporas, and mostly post-Soviet, former Soviet Korean diaspora known as Koryo-Sara, Koryo-in, the Korean people, who originally came from the very north of the Korean peninsula. And this is also something we are going to talk about today, and this is why we're actually talking about North Korea and my trip to North Korea as such, because I did it this year. So this is the latest part of my research dedicated to the Koryo-Sara or Koryo-in diaspora. What I did, I went to Korea and I crossed this country on a regular passenger train. And the trip lasted about a week in total, and I did it in order to step in and follow the path of my ancestors, who moved from the very north of North Korea, Hamgyong province, as it used to be, and now before the separation, when Korea was still one country, and now North and South Hamgyong. So I traveled to North and South Hamgyong, following the footsteps of Koryo-Sara. And if you are familiar a little bit with my projects and the talks I gave here in 2017 and 2016, they have been mostly about one big project, a documentary multimedia, a long read called Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean Story, which hopefully we'll also have time today to talk about the third part, where North Korea and our Korean people come again into close contact. But if you're interested in this topic, I'll give you the links later. So it's been Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean Story, telling all the history behind the immigration of the Korean diaspora, first from the very north of North Korea, present-day North Korea, to Russia, and then the deportation to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to Central Asia in 1937. And since then, I came back last year and talked again about the history behind this diaspora and its deportation and its involvement into the Soviet history. Because these Koreans have been living in Russia, well, in Russia first. They moved to Russia over 150 years ago, and since then they have been living in Russia and former Soviet Union. So, and over 75 years ago, over 80 years ago actually, sorry, over 80 years ago they were deported to Central Asia. But their past is the past which is very closely and very deeply linked and intertwined with the Soviet history, and also the history of the DPRK, the present-day North Korea. So this is something I would like to talk about today and show you a little bit more of this enigmatic and closed country as I saw it, trying to follow the footsteps and route of my ancestors. And then also, hopefully, we'll have time left, and when Professor Pearson is here, we can talk about the history and about the involvement of our Koreans, these Koryo-Saran people or Soviet Koreans, into the history behind the formation of the present-day North Korea. or the DPRK as we know it. So it's after the Second World War, like post-1945, and throughout the second half of the 20th century, basically. So I think that would be a very nice thing to talk with him, and because he's a historian, so he would like to ask and comment. But I would like to start, maybe, I guess everyone is also interested in this, and that's why you came here to see actually North Korea and the glimpses of North Korea. So I prepared some photos from my trip, which lasted 1 week, and I just wanted to show you North Korea, how I saw it on that train journey, basically. We spent 2 days in Pyongyang, like two days and a half in Pyongyang. Then about 2 days and a half we traveled on the train, on a regular passenger train, crossing North Korea. I brought the map also, which we actually got in Pyongyang, so it's the North Korean map of the Korean Peninsula, which they call the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And then we can see later, or whenever you want on the map, actually the actual journey we did. So it was first crossing the country from west to east, from Pyongyang to Hamhung, and then actually going up the East Korea Bay, like the eastern coast, through South and North Hamgyong, all the way to Rason, to the free economic area of Rason, on the border between North Korea and Russia, and then crossing into Russia. So it was a unique trip in a way, because I went there as a tourist. I went there on my own as a tourist, but with a tourist group. So because they only permit the group tourism starting from 2 people at least, so 2 people or more. We were 9 people, and we were actually the first tourist group which was allowed to do the journey. So we were the first people in a tourist group to cross North Korea like that, and to travel through Pyongyang, Hamhung, like from west to east, and then all the way north through South and North Hamgyong, basically. So we saw places maybe no one have seen before us, and we were allowed to the areas no one has been allowed before, and it was a very personal journey. It was a very also important and kind of striking journey in many ways. So I'll show you how I saw North Korea in all these places. And I went with an agency which is called Koryo Tours. And if you are interested, later I can also tell you more about them and give you the links, because there are several agencies that run such kind of tourism. I mean, tourism to North Korea is a possible thing to do, actually. I mean, they try to promote it. And it's a costly enterprise, but I mean, pretty much anyone can do it. But unfortunately, the South Korean citizens and American citizens, South Korean citizens are not allowed to North Korea, but American citizens used to be allowed. So it's actually the prohibition from the US side, but in theory, they would be allowed to North Korea as the Japanese citizens are, for instance. So other than that, pretty much anyone can go, and they try to promote tourism. And however, of course, everyone knows how difficult and dangerous and restrictive it can be. So that agency called Koryo Tours, they're really great, and they've been running that kind of tourism for the last 25 years. So they are really very trustworthy, and I know them personally, and I went with them. So if you are later interested, I'll tell you more about them and tourism in North Korea. But I think I'll better show the picture. So basically, we flew to North Korea. We flew to Pyongyang from Beijing on Koryo Airlines, the North Korean Airlines, and we were not allowed to photograph. I mean, we were pretty much not allowed to photograph anything officially, but I tried. I used the cell phone, and then I archived pictures. Like I was kind of hiding them, and I don't really have pictures there of anything that dangerous or provocative, but they just mostly don't allow you to take pictures of like people in real life and conditions and like poverty. But I mean, here they are. So here we are on the airplane entering Pyongyang. So you can see this was our first impression of Pyongyang. We saw a lot of cars, which was surprising. There was even some traffic and all kinds of cars, actually, old and new and kind of Soviet and Chinese, and a lot of movement, economic movement. So that was something very interesting. And this is the taxi cab. There are a lot of them in Pyongyang, and it was very interesting because those people who have been to Beijing, I've lived in Beijing for the last 6 years, and I traveled to North Korea from China, from Beijing. Also, these are like taxi cabs you see everywhere in China, in Beijing. So this was something like, oh, it looks like like China, like Beijing to me. And this is the Arc of Triumph, which actually celebrates the liberation of Korea from the Japanese colonization and like the victory in that war. They have their own names basically for all major wars and victories, but like historically it's the liberation of Korea from the Japanese colonization. So the art celebrates that. And this is the Kim Il-sung Square, the center of Pyongyang, where they take tourists on the first day. Mostly, usually when you come to North Korea as a tourist, you always have to follow the agenda, the official agenda, and you have to go to all the memorials, and you have to pay respect to their leaders. I mean, you cannot really kind of freely mingle. You have to observe the etiquette and the agenda. And one striking thing for us was, I mean, you can travel to North Korea on many different festive and important occasions, and this is the kind of tourism also they try to promote. But even if we went, because this was a special trip basically to cross the whole country, it did not coincide with any major festivity or any major parade or like mass game or anything. So there were no people. Like Pyongyang, we pretty much saw it pretty much empty. But you see the spots, this is where the people stand, like for all the, because they do like rehearsals, very long rehearsals for all their major activities and festivities with a lot of people involved. And they train for months. And these spots basically, they indicate like where each people stands. And this was something very striking because that whole huge area in the center of the city, in front of the Kim Il-sung Palace, pretty much between the Juche Tower and Kim Il-sung Palace, huge, like massive central area of Pyongyang. It was covered with these dots, so you can imagine like how many people like stand there and have to train and everything. And this is the Juche Memorial, well, the Juche Tower actually, and the Juche, it's basically the cornerstone of North Korean ideology and the regime and the whole idea and philosophy and the teaching, the political teaching of self-sufficiency. And this is also something which is very interesting because the history of the Soviet involvement and like Soviet Korean involvement is actually very closely linked to the time around which this Juche idea was formed and announced as like the political system and the ideological and spiritual system of North Korea. So hopefully when Dr. Pearson is here we can talk about it a bit more. Yeah, but this is actually the celebration of it, the tower and the Juche Tower, the self-sufficiency tower, and you can climb up and see the city. This is me, selfie. I have to take a selfie here, right? But why I put it there, I wanted to show the car. Like you see the car passing by behind. It's like a very modern, like Jeep, I guess, huge, very expensive Western car. So just to show you how like it becomes so different, like North Korea and Pyongyang especially, because I mean everyone talks about it, and the research shows how I mean now much more active economically North Korean economy is, and many people also. We were in a group with a lot of tourists who've been traveling like many times. Like I was one of those few who went for the first time. But there were people who went there like many times throughout the last like 20-25 years, and they told me like, we have never seen Pyongyang like this, we have never seen North Korea like this, with so many cars and like with kind of bustling economic life, at least in the capital. And here we are at the brewery. Basically, they brew beer. It's the biggest brewery in the center of the city, and of course they take all tourists there. But I mean, it's not to show off. It's not propaganda. It's actually where every North Korean person, pretty much like Pyongyang person, goes after work. It was huge and lively. It was full of people, full of locals. One great thing to go to North Korea as a tourist, like unlike more official journalist delegations, which they rarely allow, but like if they do, they restrict the access a lot. Like for us, and also because of the company we went with, Koryo Tours, and their like very long involvement with tourism in North Korea, they're very trustworthy over there. And also we kind of showed ourselves as being a nice group of tourists. So our minders and guides, they actually let us do many things. And I'm not sure how regular it is for everyone, but we were like a nice group, so they took us everywhere they could. So we went to the brewery, and it was full of locals. And I remember when there in the afternoon, they didn't have lights on, so for most of the time we were like in half dark with a lot of people. But then the lights went on at the end. It was very nice. They let us talk to the people, and I mean, many of us didn't speak Korean. Like I speak some Korean. I've been studying Korean over these years. Like some people who spoke more Korean, it was better for them. But we'll try to talk to the locals. And they had 7 kinds of beers there. So we were like drinking beer with the locals and just observing this, I mean, this very kind of thing you wouldn't imagine and you wouldn't expect to see. So just like a nice, brewery, and people just relaxing after work, and the waitresses, they were amazing. They actually were holding, I remember that one, she could hold I think 8 beer mugs with 2 hands. She was able to hold like 4 in each, and they were very efficient. So one thing about also like North Korean people I personally noticed is how efficient they are, and they're really very perfectionist. So they really try to do everything to the best way they can. It's I think it's also their I thought it was their spirit, because I mean they know, like they're very much aware of all the difficulties they live with, and I mean life is very hard for them. But they're very like strong-spirited people, and they just try to do everything to the best level they can. You can say it's part of the regime and propaganda because we don't have choice. Otherwise, they're like purged and sent to the camps. But I think it's also the something more than that, and something higher than that. It's the mentality and the spirit, and it's very admirable. We were all very much admiring it. So, and. That was our first day in Pyongyang, more or less. On the second day, they took us to the Mansudae Memorial to pay respect to the leaders, and that's what everyone does. I mean, local people and tourists, you have to go and pay respect to fathers of the nation, Chairman Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and pretty much local people just do it. I mean, they do it as part of their routine and etiquette and like work routine and social routine, like they're obliged to do it. But even if they just pass by, they do it also. Like they buy flowers. It's something, I think, which is deeply ingrained into their psyche, both I mean on purpose, obligatory, but also I think they used to do it now. It's something very natural to do for them. For us, it was not, and we were very strictly instructed to how to do it. I'll show you. I have a group picture actually. After bowing, after paying the respect, like we're all standing in one line. So when we were doing it, they put us in one line. They were very strict and very precise. Like they said, you have to stand in one line. You have to take off your sunglasses and hats. Like we put them back afterwards because it was very cold. I went there during the winter. It was February, so it was very cold there. And then they offered us the group picture, which we took. So we're already like still standing in one line with our hats and everything on. But yeah, there was something also very, very interesting for us. And I mean, you don't have choice, you have to do it. So this is part also of coming to North Korea as a tourist. You have to behave the way the locals do. You're in Rome, act like Romans do. Then we went to the, it's called the Victorious, I think the Fatherland Liberation War Victory, the Museum of Fatherland Liberation War Victory, which is basically the victory in the Korean War. So it's when the North Korea was created, the DPRK as a state. They considered they won that war, and this is the liberation victory for them in that war. And next to it, at the background, you can see the famous Rugyong Hotel, which is the highest unoccupied building in the world. It's actually the newest hotel they're building in Pyongyang, and it's very impressive on the city landscape, and they still haven't opened it. It's 106 floors, if I'm not mistaken. So this is really like the modern-day Pyongyang's landmark, one of modern-day Pyongyang landmark. And then in that museum, of course, we followed the routine and saw all the way how they see their the history related to the Korean War and their participation in the Korean War, and their victories they consider it. And also there is the USS Pueblo, what is it called, the submarine, the American submarine they actually got in 1968. So it was supposedly doing research, but they insisted that they were spying on North Korea, so they were able to capture the the submarine together with the whole team, and they show it at the museum. So this is our guide. And military, they bring a lot of military, they bring a lot of students and military to all these places, basically to teach them their history. And like we were not allowed to photo them, but I mean, here they are. And our guide, she was lovely, and lovely on a personal level, but very strict, of course, in the interpretation of how they show their history to the tourists and everyone else. And this is the food. The food stall or the little food shop, which was another amazing thing for us to see, because you can see that it's quite abundant. So in Pyongyang, basically at every corner pretty much we saw these like little shops full of like street food and snacks, which is also something other people who were in the group with me noticed, that they said like it's never been like that before. Like you can really see that like they obviously they don't have those many food shortages anymore, and like all the products are locally, most of them are locally produced, so they produce a lot of food and like snacks and all kinds of things. But unfortunately we're not able to buy anything, because foreigners are not allowed to have a North Korean currency, and like you cannot do this kind of exchanges freely on the street. So we were just looking at them, and once actually they let us do it, but it was kind of thanks to our guides and the person we were with in our group who was from our tourist agency, and he had some North Korean money. But like other than that, unfortunately, you can only look. Like you cannot do any direct transaction, like any direct interaction in terms of communication or currency, really, with North Korean people. So it still is very, very restrictive. And we were allowed to go to metro and ride several metro stops. Also, we could freely mingle and communicate with people. Like they didn't restrict it for us, and again, if you like, the better you knew the language, it would be to do for you. But again, like we were able to mingle, take pictures, like walk in the metro and take trains. Like nothing was arranged really, and I mean that was another great thing, because many people actually complain, especially journalists, which I guess they restrict much more. They complain like they cannot do it. Like we were able pretty much to do it freely, and but they only limited our access to several stops. Like we could ride on several metro stops, like go down the metro and then get out. But they let us get out on several metro stops to see different stations and see the people and kind of mingle and communicate with the people. And of course, the metro wagons themselves, they are old style, like Soviet, from Moscow and Berlin. So they're very similar. Like I felt like home, because I'm from Uzbekistan. It's a former Soviet country. Until very recently, we had the same metro. Well, I mean, we still have like the same metro. It's the same construction pretty much in former Soviet countries, like in Moscow, in Tashkent. It's the same type of like metro, and that we used to have the same like metro trains. So I felt like at home pretty much when I rode that metro. I was like, I'm back to Tashkent. But I mean, we didn't have the portraits of dear leaders. They do. And we were able to talk to people, and we randomly, actually, it was not staged. We just, because we were kind of getting out and in, and like, I don't think you could stage this. And it was packed with people, and we just like spotted a boy who was with a foreign textbook, and I speak Spanish, so they told me, he speaks Spanish, so go talk to him. And I started speaking Spanish to him, and he was very annoyed. He was very scared, like he was extremely scared. It was Portuguese, it was not Spanish. And we just started talking to them, and they were like, what do they want from us? What do these foreigners want from us? But his grandmother, he was with his grandmother, she was so proud. And at the end, we actually had another tourist who did speak Portuguese, so he started speaking Portuguese with the boy. The boy was extremely annoyed, and like he didn't want to talk to us, but his grandmother was like super proud, so I remember it was like very nice and human moment for us as well. So, and this is like the kind of the street scene, the trains, like they have very peculiar, like old style transportation, and trams and buses, and then metro, and then of course the handwritten propaganda. All the propaganda is handwritten, so it's also like kind of art in itself, if you can see it that way. And then the city scenery with the trams, and that hotel I was talking, Region Hotel, and then the Mansudae Memorial. You can see the figures of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. So it's I mean, the city is very charming in a way. I mean, it's very impressive. And this is the view to the eastern part of Pyongyang from the Juche Tower. We were allowed to climb the Juche Tower and like see the city panorama from the like bird's eye view. So it was something very, very nice. And the new area, they have several streets, like several districts in Pyongyang. This is Remyon Street, where they've been building, like this is kind of the latest kind of style of the architecture. Then, fortunately, actually destroying some of the old buildings, which is very sad. I think that's something that happens in all modern cities in a way, especially in the developing world, where they just destroy kind of the old quarters and they build the new. So that's the building they've been doing, like, and we saw like a lot of construction somehow in certain parts of the city, in only in the certain areas, of course, but then some old buildings, like kind of they had this Soviet also, like. Parts on them that have been being destroyed, unfortunately. So, and this is another. So that was Remyon Street, which is quite modern. This is Mire Street, and in Korean, Mire means future. So they are. I mean, they are way of presenting it that that street they're building the modern buildings for teachers and scientists, like all the important people of the future. So those who have knowledge and like. Suppose that they will be living in those buildings mostly, like first and foremost, teachers and scientists. So, but it's very small, but it's nice. I mean, it's interesting to see that they're also trying to do this kind of modern day architecture with like a lot of lights. Lights were on most pretty much in that part of the city. They were on pretty much until very late. I mean, we were there very late already. So it was something interesting. It's something probably unexpected for us to see. And this is part of the map. So after 2.5 days in Pyongyang, we were on the road in the train. So we boarded the train at the Pyongyang Central Station, which is a little bit below, like Pyongyang is below on this map. And this is our journey to cross South and North Hamgyong provinces. And you see the Kim Jong-il quote, "Our country is the 3,000-ri golden tapestry, like land linked with the same mountain range." So basically they consider the whole Korean peninsula People's Democratic Republic of Korea. So I brought the map, it's here. So later if you want to have a look at it and see our journey a little bit closer. So this is our group and the famous train from Pyongyang to Moscow, part of Trans-Siberian, and this is the train we crossed North Korea on. And our guides, like people call them minders also, well they are, but like they were very nice with us actually. They are on both sides, Mr. Kim and Miss Kim. They were not related, but they all had the same last name I also have. I'm also Kim, so well they actually we had 6 guides in total, guides or minders. We had 2 in Pyongyang. One of them stayed with us on the train, and then another one joined. So we had 2 on the train and 2 in Rason. We also stayed 3 days. And they were very nice, actually. I mean, they really tried to show us as much as we could. Like we didn't feel they were spying on us, but rather we felt that they were struggling to give us as much access as they could, taking the difficulties of their job also. So she's waving goodbye. we all knew that like we would never see each other again with them. Like they became basically our closest friends in North Korea because they were with us all the time. They spoke English and they were very nice, and like we had most of communication we had with them. Of course, they gave us all the propaganda speech and the interpretation, official interpretation about everything. But we had a lot of very warm like human contact, and it was difficult to part even after 2 days and a half because we knew like we cannot give them a call, we cannot write them an email, we'll never see them, and it was like somehow a very touching farewell, as if you were like losing someone, like a friend or even like a family member almost. So we started our journey, and this is South Hamgyong, and these piles, this is natural, well, they're very proud, the North Koreans very proudly call it organic fertilizer. Basically, it's what do you call it, like human manure, and they have quota. They are obliged to collect it. Also, I mean, it has some animal dung, but it's pretty much human manure. So everyone collects it throughout the whole country, and all land in North Korea, like the provinces we crossed, at least frozen land, everywhere you saw that those piles of human manure. Basically, it's very like fertilized, and all land is used, and it's very strict, something very strict. So you can only imagine really the condition of people have to live in, that you have to fertilize your country like that, and you have to collect basically it and then like supply the state with. So this was something very impressive for us. And the little villages on the way with Kim Il-sung portrait, and this is a train station, small train station with the propaganda at the background honoring Kim Il-sung, Chairman Kim Il-sung, and a lot of military we saw pretty much on each station. Like all the, basically the train, like railroad is their only way for them to travel really across the country, because we saw some cars, of course, in Pyongyang, but outside the capital and big cities, that, like there is no transportation. Like they don't have vehicles. They have very few and very old. So people mostly bike, use oxen carts. I'll show you later, and use the train. And access to train is also very limited. It's like a strategic, basically strategic object and way of transportation. So it's very, very strongly secured. So at each station and pretty much everywhere you see like numerous levels of security, like soldiers and like security guards on the train, and etc. And a lot of accidents on the road. So I'll tell you maybe a little bit later in more detail. This is Yodok, the famous, well, the infamous, I should rather say, place in South Hamgyong, where one of the biggest labor camps is, and we didn't stop there, we just crossed the station, just like very kind of randomly and regularly, but I mean it was striking just to pass through and to take a picture of like your train station, like that train station where you would probably not like to get off. And these are people doing field work. Basically, what we saw also on the way, like a lot of collective work, and as many of you might know, basically, North Koreans, they like live, function, and work in units, like both at in cities and like in rural areas, in small kind of units which are very tightly controlled. So the levels of control are numerous. Starts like at the lower level, goes all the way to the hierarchy of control, like it's very sophisticated. Starting at the lowest level with these units, where like always be like a kind of a head controlling his group or her group, and going all the way up the hierarchy of the whole state, like population and state apparatus. But this was something striking for us to see. We saw like I mean, it was freezing, February, frozen land, and then still people, they were doing like manual labor, field works, controlled, and kind of also basically operating in those groups. And we could clearly see in the way how like there would be a minder in each group, kind of commanding the rest of the people. And of course, this type of picture like we're not allowed to take, but like we did and I did, and a lot of very old and rusty infrastructure. Like they're using all, I mean, the equipment is very outdated, very old, but they're using every piece of basically metal they have, and it's all kind of running or trying kind of to be running. And a lot of, again, each station, everywhere along the road, a lot of security, a lot of control, like a lot of policing. We saw a lot of resources also, because those provinces are like remote and coldest and kind of harshest and most uninhabited provinces, but also they're very rich in resources, and the Rason economic area is there. So there was a lot of, we saw a lot of movement of major natural resources like coal and wood. And we had a feeling that it was going out of Russia, maybe to North Korea. Like we couldn't be certain how local it all was, but we thought there was also clearly some transportation of resources going back and forth, like even with all the sanctions and everything. So basically, that's how they tried to survive. And very beautiful landscape, like those typical kind of Korean landscape, or you call Korean landscape, with pines and mountains. It's like very something very nostalgic and very touching. And this is me with the workers, the basically construction workers that are allowed to leave North Korea and travel to Russia, to mostly like Khabarovsk in these areas, and do like very low-skilled labor, like very low-skilled construction, but they're kind of considered elite in North Korea because they are mostly from Pyongyang. They're officially going through the like state-sponsored programs, like exchange between ministries of labor of the DPRK and Russia, and they speak Russian, so I actually was able to talk to them. One amazing thing on the train is that at the beginning they told us like we were not allowed to do anything, but during the course of the journey, they really let us do everything. So we drove with these people. We were able to talk to them. Like I talked with them, and we exchanged like our views on politics. It was amazing. They are construction workers, but they are very. I mean, I thought they were very educated for the job they do, because like we had all kinds of political debates, and actually one of them told me his interpretation of geopolitical system around North Korea, how he saw it. And of course, I mean, it's a lot of propaganda, but I mean, they're very much aware of the struggle their country has to go through, and like the limitations and the sanctions. And of course, I mean, they blame the rest of the world pretty much for not helping them. And I mean, you can understand those people because you see the conditions they live in. You see, like he was telling me, well, I mean, you think we don't understand that all these trains are old and outdated, and like we're struggling, we have almost nothing. Well, I mean, who is helping us? Like no one is helping us. Like we're alone against the whole world, pretty much. We are on our own against the whole world. Of course, we should build the bomb, and like that's our only, or like the missile, and it's our only way of, kind of standing strong against the whole world. It was a very interesting discussion to have with construction workers in Russian. And actually, I'm from Uzbekistan originally. There were a lot of Uzbeks working together with them, doing those like construction works in Russia. So it was very interesting, something really. And then, of course, there was no electricity like outside Pyongyang. There were during the night, so we spent the night on the train. There was no electricity anywhere, like nothing was lit but the portraits. Like everywhere, like all the train stations we crossed, the only thing that consistently had electricity were the portraits of their leaders, and pretty much the memorials, or also like some kind of commemorative sites where their leaders had ever stepped out or something like that. So like they had consistently, like they had been consistently lit up electrically, but other than that, like there were no lights. It was really like something very striking and terrible. You could see how limited the people's resources were outside the major capital, major cities. And here we crossed into North Hamgyong, and you could see the villages of North Hamgyong, like kind of fishermen villages, because North Hamgyong was already much closer to the East Korea Bay, and like all covered in snow, so villages and some kids, and the typical scenery and landscape, for me it was very striking, because this is the Far East for me, because my major purpose was to cross from North Korea to Russia through that province where like our Korean people came from, and it's pretty much the same scenery landscape you see on North Korean side and on the Russian side. It was like just something striking, just kind of to see this like Far East, Korean and Russian Far East, and those beautiful winter landscapes. This is the East Korea Bay, and some kids playing basketball. So these like little fishermen villages and parks. And this is another important strategic place we crossed. It's the Orang military airport. So it's where the military airport and military base is. We also didn't, we were not able to get off the train there, but like we saw this place, and like you see the sun panels. They try to use solar panels. They try to use solar energy a lot, especially in that province. We saw it like on a lot of objects, like public objects and state objects. Also, even the villages, like many houses on top, they had solar panels. So it was like very interesting, because it's the poorest and most remote province, but they really trying to use solar energy there. And of course, multiple levels of control on all trains, and outside the trains, and just seeing kind of local people getting out and in with a lot of restrictions as well, a lot of military. And the station of Ranam, we were already close to the Rason, the free economic area of Rason, and this is Rajin. Rajin is the center of Rason. I mean, it's the same place basically, but the former name is Rajin. Now they call it Rason. But it's like the center of the economic area. It's pretty much the city, free economic zone. Like it's the city of Rajin and the outskirts. And there we spent 2 days and a half as well in Rason, in the free economic area. It was very different from the rest of North Korea. Also, this area, it's actually it's isolated. Like you don't have free access. Like North Korean citizens, they cannot access that area. They cannot access Rason from the rest of North Korea. So our guides, like our minders, they couldn't come with us to Rason. They stayed outside Rason on the one train station before that, and we had new guides in Rason. And also there was no communication, like there was no cellular network coverage, and it's a separate topic how the cellular network operates. Everything is in itself is pretty much isolating, but even though like it didn't work in Rason, so Rason has its own special like cellular network. So it's pretty much isolated in itself, and it's easy actually for foreigners to enter Rason than for local Koreans. Back and forth, a lot of Russians work there, and you can have a green card. Actually, until most recently, now with the sanctions, I don't know how much you can do, but actually you can come and live in Rason, and like they give you like, it's a separate kind of visa. It's not a visa, it's like a permit to live in Rason, but like you kind of get a green card pretty much to live in Rason and do businesses. And they even had like Western businessmen kind of trying to do, I don't know, maybe like some kind of maybe like dairy business there or some kind of sustainable business. So it's like a very peculiar place, and still you see local residents there, very poor and scarce, propaganda of Kim Jong-un, I believe, at the background. They took us to all kind of the newest facilities in Rason, to salmon breeding factories. So this is where they breed salmon, like local, very local North Korean salmon. And I mean, this picture doesn't have fish, but there was fish there. Like they did have salmon there. And this is the mekchu. That's the kind of Korean rice and potato beer, kind of very light, lightly alcoholic drink. And this is the factory which produces soft drinks and like Korean alcohol. We also went to a new, like the newest shoes factory, where they mostly do like sports. They make sportswear, like in sports shoes. And then we went to a bank, and we were able. This is my money, not my hand, our guide exchanging my money. We were able to actually exchange, because we were crossing into Russia, so they let us, actually they opened the bank for, like the bank was closed on the weekend, they opened the bank just for us on Saturday, because they were like very thrilled that they were coming and like we needed money, so they opened the bank for us. It's the only bank in Rason, it only operates in Rason. They opened accounts to each of us, and they gave us all cards. We all opened bank accounts and got like kind of debit cards, which we only could use there, nowhere else. And then they actually exchanged our money, our dollars and euros and Chinese renminbi into Russian rubles. So it was like an amazing thing to do in North Korea. And they also let us use Korean wons in Rason, but that's the only place we could use our Korean wons, because in the rest of the country you cannot use local currency. In Rason we could, so we could actually take it and see it and like hold it for a couple of days, but they told us very strictly, you cannot take it out of North Korea, so spend it. And that was the only place where they allowed us to go to the market, and we were not able to take pictures there, any type of pictures, but like in the rest of North Korea, they don't allow tourists going to like markets. In Rason they did, so it was also a very interesting experience. And I mean, we were both, like all of us were thrilled, like us, foreign tourists, and local people on the market. So it was something very lively. And then just like a girl going to the school with North Korean propaganda at the background, kind of regular people's lives. The kindergarten, also you see the what kind of pictures they paint for little like kids in the kindergarten. So the propaganda starts pretty much, I guess, shortly after birth. And we were able actually to go to school. It was a secondary school, like they actually had, they were very proud. They were teaching foreign languages, and the students spoke very good English, and we were able to go and give them half an hour English class, like kind of communication session. And they were very strict. They told us which topics we couldn't talk with them about. And they were both girls and boys, but like boys were sitting on in a separate section of the classroom. So, and like they actually let us, like they chose whom we could talk to. And they told us we couldn't talk about politics, we couldn't talk about religion, and we couldn't talk about sex with them. So like these three topics were not permitted. Other than that, like we pretty much could talk to them. But of course, I mean, it was all very strictly organized, and we mostly tried to ask questions about, like, we didn't want to make their life more difficult, so we mostly asked their questions, like the questions about the school and stuff like that. So it was also very interesting. And the propaganda, the school propaganda. And we also went to a hotel, a Hong Kong hotel, which has a casino in Rason. It's owned by a Hong Kong millionaire, and everything inside is imported from China. So it was shortly after the Chinese New Year, and they were putting the decorations off. So it was also a very interesting place to go. And we saw the oil refinery in Rason. Because of the sanctions, it was not working, but it was there working until most recently. And this is something I mentioned. Local people mostly use bicycles and oxen carts as transportation, and they pretty much don't have other vehicles in these remote areas, which was also very striking during this winter climate, to see how, I mean, difficult it's for people just to move on the roads in very, very basic and precarious conditions. Finally, before crossing into Russia, we went to the Friendship House between Russia and North Korea in the DPRK, where the North Korean leadership regularly met with the Soviet leaders and Russian leaders, like local governors, and even like bigger, like even presidents and their leaders of their state. So we were not able to take pictures inside. And this is the tri-border area, finally, where three borders come together. Next to the Tumen River, it's the DPRK, North Korea, as we know it, China, People's Republic of China, and Russia. So they all come together here at this spot. And was a very important moment, just to be there and to do that crossing. Basically, that's what I came for. That's what I came to North Korea for. cross that river. This is the Tumen River, and this is the pathway our Korean diaspora took over 150 years ago to leave North Korea and, well, back then still unified Korea, and move into Russian territory. So this is what we did on the train, but just to be there was something very emotional personally for me, and just to get there was something very, very emotional and important for me. And this is all the Russian territory, so we are crossing on the train into Russia. And this is already you see Russian worker on the railroad. So for us it was like free world. we were like freedom, we did it. So, and this is Russia already, and the Amur Bay, beautiful winter landscapes, and this is Vladivostok, and the famous bridge that puts together Vladivostok with the Russian island, constructed by the President Putin a couple of years, 2012 or so. So that was the end of the journey, and I think here I'll stop so we can continue.
Thank you so much. Fascinating,
history
and
yeah.
photos. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'm wondering how to exit.
Well, we have nearly half an hour.
Yeah. What? Sorry. I'll just
Yeah.
I have another PPT on history, so I was hoping to use that one as well. So
Yeah.
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 So, but yes, but no. I mean for the discussion, if there will be a related discussion. Not that I'm going through it right now. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you very much for joining. My apologies for running late. I was stuck in a meeting. I'm James Person. I teach the Korea Studies courses here at SAIS. And I know probably a lot of you have questions, so I will just thank you for coming back and sharing your experience, and then I actually have just a few quick questions on your what I was able to see from your pictures. But really, it sounds like you had a very unique experience, and you were able to get a lot of insight into and get access to and see things that most travelers do not, perhaps. Thank you for sharing these experiences. Just a couple quick questions. One, you mentioned that your minders that had accompanied you throughout the duration of the trip had to stay out and sort of leave you when you entered Razan. Is that because of this fear of exposing them to the polluting influences of capitalism in the area, or what was your sense of that? Why did you have to, and how would you, how do you understand, or how did you perceive the fact that you had, for example, separate cell phone networks, that cell phone service was cut off there? Is that, again, to sort of isolate the community and to prevent these polluting influences from spreading throughout the general population? And what then does this suggest to you about any prospects for opening or introduction, even in small ways, of capitalism? Another question I have is you pointed out that as you were riding the train, you'd see these at night, where you wouldn't have electricity in homes and whatnot, but then the public sort of statues or images of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were always illuminated, and then also the mosaics were. You showed also solar panel later. I've seen in and around Pyongyang the use of solar panels on statues, and a lot of people would say, oh well, the electricity is being channeled to these, whereas the population is not. But in fact, they were solar panels that were illuminating these statues at all times when the rest of the city was dark. did you see solar panels at illuminating these portraits, for example, or were they in fact channeling electricity?
Yeah.
What was your sense on that? But I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to just keep it at that.
Yeah. Sure. Well, answering the first question, I mean, I mean, definitely Rason is very, very strictly isolated from the rest of North Korea, and North Korea is very strictly also isolated from to people who live and work in Rason, because Rason was really a unique place. I had a feeling, because it definitely felt like before coming back to the US, we've been living in China for the last 6 years, so it definitely felt more like China, kind of in a way that it was like a more developing. You could feel like this more developing economically and like capitalistically, as you would say. I mean, a lot of Russians working there, having all the like technical jobs, like basically maintaining the road, engineers, because we crossed the customs, and I was able to talk to actually Russian workers who were also crossing the customs. A lot of trucks, Russian trucks, they actually transport a lot of goods like between Russia and Rason. I mean, you can clearly see that there is a lot of exchange going on, and but I mean, it's very strictly controlled, like bureaucratically, and it's a different like as we understood as tourists, different visa system. Like to North Korea, we got a visa. Like to Rason, it was like a different visa. So everything is very separate, and I think the Rason for them is like their kind of pride as the free several. They have like 3 or 4, if I'm not mistaken, free economic zones in North Korea. So it's their pride, because really 5 currencies are used. Like they allow foreigners. Like until most recently, they allowed like businesses, even like kind of small entrepreneurs. Because of the sanctions now, it's very difficult for them. Like really, Rason was really hit with economic sanctions. Like I think it was hit probably even maybe much harder than the rest of North Korea with all the latest sanctions over the recent years. But I mean, clearly this is something also experimental for them, and you could see and feel a lot of all in our hotel. Everything was from China, imported from China. Like all the like in the bathrooms, everything was like Chinese, like bathtubs and heaters and everything, and you could clearly see that this is something for them. It's also definitely experimental and kind of like it's a pretty much they're trying to introduce the capitalist system economically at least, but they keep it very, very separate from the rest of population and from the rest of the country, and clearly this is something that probably they'll do gradually if they ever will, and people just couldn't enter. Like you just kind of they've been like separate from it. Like it's the paperwork, you don't have visa, like you don't have access, you don't have like documents to access, like you don't have even kind of, you cannot even communicate. So it's very kind of strictly organized and separate. So yeah, and you asked. The second question was about the solar panels.
The illuminating
Yep. So we saw it outside of Pyongyang, also throughout north and south, Hamgyong. We saw solar panels illuminating some of the, not everywhere, but clearly during the day, at least in one place, I saw personally solar panel illuminating the place where, I don't remember if Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il like stepped there once in his life, and then they kept it like as a kind of memorial place or something, and there was a solar panel there. So they do use solar panels for those kinds of purposes. But also, again, as I mentioned, in North Hamgyong, especially, everywhere we saw solar panels, like on top of the buildings, on top of the rooftops, and there were like villages basically living like homes. So like they I don't know how easy for them is to access solar panels, like I'm not sure, but like that they use them a lot, they do, and we could see it. And then maybe the fact that it was very close to Rason and Russia, maybe it's easier to get them somehow. And I mean, they import them from China, I guess, also. So I'm not sure if they're locally made, I wouldn't think so.
I've seen, for example, I was wandering around the just outside of Pyongyang. You have the unification celebrating the 1972 July 4th inter-Korean agreement. You have this giant statue of 2 women reaching over the road, holding the points of the agreement, and you had these solar panels that were actually built on the ground. They were Chinese, but they were sort of in the ground, and they would illuminate this massive statue every day. So.
Yeah. I think it's easy to import them
Yeah.
easier through the area like Rason economic area and just geographically, and thanks to those unique opportunities they kind of try to create those kinds of imports. So
Great. Well, thank you. I'm sure there are lots of questions out. So we can open the floor.
And if you want to talk about history later, it was supposed to be the other part of this presentation. So
So we start.
Yeah, my question is also regarding Assam, but I was curious how they decide who can live and work there, and if you had any contact with any kind of type of media while you were there, if they had different types of newspapers that can circulate in there, or if the people living there have access to any more information, like ideologically, or sort of because they have so much more interaction with China and Russia.
yeah.
Do you want to take one question at a time, or do you want to collect a couple?
Whatever is the best way, maybe we can collect or I can answer.
Okay.
So,
Let's collect another.
yeah. So
Thank you for sharing us your pictures. I was wondering, you talked about like economic development and a lot of construction going on. There was a report earlier this year talking about how they're using their army to use free labor. I was wondering if you noticed any of that report being true. And also, another question is, I noticed there's a lot of different type of architectural designs in these constructions. So it seems like they're like usually if one like state-owned enterprise is in charge of all the construction, most of the buildings have this similar design. It just seems to be very, very different. Like you had the one with the really ugly green construction, then you had the one that kind of looked like South Korean apartment buildings. So I was wondering do you know anything more information about that?
sure.
One more.
I'd like to ask about the electricity and the energy situation, even though they asked that. Because it is said that the North Korea doesn't like let the tourists in during the winter time because they don't like they cannot treat the tourists as good as they would like to, so they don't like to show the situation with the electricity and everything. So could you tell me what it was like, what your life was like in North Korea in terms of the electricity and energy things? And also, did you see any artifacts of the economic sanction in North Korea?
That's quite fascinating, actually. That also struck me. The winter, I know, is when the rivers freeze, the hydroelectric dams that produce electricity are of course. So that is a great period of hardship. So it also struck me that you were able to go there. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, okay. More or first by
No, let's start with those. Yeah.
So there was communications, right? Well, one thing immediately I personally noticed in Rason is that it was the same thing in Pyongyang because we only stayed outside the train in two places, really, in Pyongyang for about 2.5 days and in Rason and Tumangang, close to the Russian border, for about 2.5 days. And both in Pyongyang and in Rason already, within the free economic area, they had this drill every morning, which I think is typical for them. It's they have the propaganda music and talks, sounding from all the loudspeakers, and it was something very striking for me because this is the first time I kind of experienced it and heard it. And very early, I think, starting about from 7:30. Well, then the people wake up and they go to work and they go to study, like they go to their designated places. They start to honoring the government and kind of talking about all the achievements and putting all this music, this patriotic music, so very loud and I mean, in a way very beautiful also, like the, of course, Bong Band and these songs like We'll Reach the mountains and the Pegdu mountain, like so we heard it, saw it in Pyongyang, and that's the usual drill, I think, daily drill for them. And in Rason it was the same thing, and we spent the weekend there. So I think on Sunday they didn't have it, but like other than that they did. So I can imagine that in terms of information exchange, it's not that different from the rest of North Korea. And of course, I mean, they are exposed to more information just by the fact that there are foreign workers there, and they have like foreign currencies operating there, and I mean, more goods coming in. Also, we were able to go to the market, for instance. We saw the market. There were like all kinds of things on the market, and clothes imported from China and also locally made. And so I think just by then, people are already more exposed, kind of informational in terms of their knowledge about the world. I don't think the routine is very different. I don't think they let them really kind of, free access to media or anything. But in general, from what it is known also from like all the defectors accounts and like all the research made, is that just in general, in the areas bordering China and Russia, especially China, where the signal, where they can catch the signal, they have like Chinese mobile phones, and even ourselves inside North Korea, in that tri-border area I showed on the pictures before crossing into Russia, because I also, when I had been living in Beijing back then, I had a Chinese mobile phone. My phone already in North Korea could catch the Chinese system. So I like temporarily had the connection. I immediately texted my husband, "I'm alive. We're still in North Korea. We're like crossing into Russia. I got the Chinese signal, so all is well." So I mean, it's true. They cannot prevent it. They get the signal, and then of course they have more communication there. But it's not less restricted. It doesn't mean that like they allow more freedom there in that sense. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, and then the second one was about the constructions. It was very interesting because I'm not sure about the details, to be honest. But I heard also that they have all these state companies. They do all kinds of things in North Korea and in Pyongyang. They have to be like very entrepreneurial, and they are very entrepreneurial because that's their way of survival. In this kind of changing economy, and they kind of they use their connection. Of course, they're run by the people who have like very high state connection, and they do everything. Like our tourist company, for instance, in North Korea, I don't know if they did constructions, but they did tourism. They had restaurants. Like they do multiple things, and I think like they also do constructions, and we saw different things. So again, I think it all depends on their connection to like the highest hierarchy within the state, and their like economic kind of and political connection, and then they do. They probably can do different things, at least like a little bit. But I'm not sure about Remyon, like that area where all the newly built houses were. But I know that the other one, like Mire, it's really like it's the pet project of kind of Kim Jong-un as well, and like the highest government. The Mire, like the future street, which is all designated for like teachers and scientists like to live on. That's something kind of very strategic for them. It's like kind of a pet project also to show that Pyongyang had that modern, really kind of part of the city. So probably that one it's more strictly controlled. And about the rest, I'm not sure, but there was a lot of construction going on, so which also shows how probably the economy is kind of changing a little bit, and how of course the state enterprises are involved into that economic development, let's say so. Yeah, and then there was the third. Yeah, to be honest, it's very interesting because I had no idea that the access was restricted in winter, like for tourism, because we were able to go in winter in February, and I think it really depends on probably on the connections. Like our tourist agency, like Western tourist agency, which I already mentioned, Korea Tours, I went there with. They really have they have incredibly secure access. Like they've been operating for over 25 years. They never compromised the trust of the North Korean government, because I mean that's the only choice probably if you want to keep bringing people in. So they never mentioned anything about like tourism being not permitted. They actually do all the time. They do all kind of tours, New Year's, like they advertise on the website. If anyone is interested, I'll be more than happy to share details afterwards. The New Year tour, end of the year tour, spend your New Year in Pyongyang in North Korea. So they run all kinds of things throughout the winter. But of course, you can see, like you can feel. For us in Pyongyang, there was not so much electricity shortage overall, but like during the 2.5 days, at least once I remember, we were in a restaurant, the electricity went off completely. and then it immediately went back on. But then we stayed maybe for a couple of minutes without electricity, and we were all like, woo, like very loudly expressing our discontent, and we immediately like shushed. We said like, no, you cannot do this. Like, don't show that you are like not happy with it. We're like, well, I mean, okay. But it happened, but it immediately came back. The light came back, and then also from what we saw until very late, because also, again, our guides, like, of course they were our minders, but like I prefer to call them guides because they really tried their best to show us as much as they could. They took us out late at night to show us this Mira Street because they're also very proud. This is something they're very proud of. I mean, they're very proud of their country in general. And in Pyongyang, at least, there was electricity, like kind of more or less constantly, like during those like 2 days and a half I was there. And you could see and feel the difference between Pyongyang and the countryside, like almost immediately, because this is somewhere like where you could clearly see that the resources were scarce. And in Rason, in the free economic zone also, we also had at least once the electricity went off and then went back on again. But then there it was also like, they were very proud of the heaters, like this is something they told us, oh, you all have each of you has your own hotel room, and there is a heater there, and it heats the water, like you'll have warm water 24/7. My heater didn't work, so it was something very disappointing. And it was a Chinese heater, and I was like, maybe they just got like, I don't know, so like blaming it on the quality, or like they got probably maybe the cheapest heater, and like it didn't work. So it was very, very disappointing because like, oh, there will be warm water. No, there was no warm water. So, I mean, they had all these kinds of shortages. But we were showed the best. Also, in terms of food, they were really trying to give us like the best service. And food was abundant, but you could clearly see that it's mostly like starch, like vegetables and carbohydrates. And in Pyongyang, meat was very limited. Like we had meat, but like you could see that it's not something like that they eat abundantly. Like in South Korea. In South Korea, of course, barbecue is something very kind of part of Korean cuisine, and like there's of course meat is much more abundant than what we felt in Pyongyang. In Rason, we had a lot of seafood also, which they tried. So I mean, they tried their best, but like you could see that like like it's hard. Like for most of North Korean people, life is hard.
Sure. Dr. President, add something about the energy? Just time is so limited, but
did you actually want to get into the history?
Yes, I did. I mean, I feel very bad if we wouldn't, because this is something that my presentation promised.
Right.
So
we have just. He was telling me we have just 5 minutes, but I don't know if that's.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be very short. So, do you have any questions on the history of Soviet-Korean involvement or anything you? Because this is the other part which I
I've written a
wanted to link.
PhD on that, so for a decade, actually for 5 years, I lived in Moscow gathering documents from the Russian archives on the relationship. But so I personally don't. But maybe are there any questions about Soviet DPRK relations?
Or I can show some videos with interviews on how the. I mean, we can do other things. If people have more questions about the trip, I can answer the questions, or I can show videos about the Soviet past.
We do. I just had another trip-related question. Do you have any pictures of your hotel rooms, or what is a typical hotel? Is it like a Marriott, mid-level Marriott or Hilton? And secondly, why on earth would anybody want to make a repeat visit to North Korea? I mean, you said there were some that made second or third trips. It seems like such a grim, restrictive place. I mean, why would you want to go back?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. Actually, especially the second part, I appreciate it very much. Well, the hotel, to be honest, I don't have like the. Maybe I should have taken pictures, but it was like a regular hotel in a way, so it was not striking so much. That's why I didn't take pictures of it. But it was like what you say. It was. We were staying in Yanggakdo Hotel in Pyongyang. There are more hotels. It's not the only hotel actually available for tourists. It used to be, and it's located right in the middle of the river, of the Tadong River, which splits Pyongyang in two halves geographically, and it's somehow like isolated on a little island in the middle of the river, so probably you cannot wander around anywhere from there, pretty much. But they also have other hotels in the city, and that famous Ryugyong hotel, they are kind of promising to open soon, also for tourists. So, yeah, inside it's kind of mid-level hotel. You've been kind of describing that.
Sagging mattresses.
And no, it was okay. I mean, it was, yeah.
Pretty hard.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it was like maybe 3-star hotel. So 2, maybe 3 at most. But I mean, it was decent. To be honest, it was decent. The breakfast there was not good. Like it was very limited. So
did you find that they were, they cater more to a Chinese clientele, and so, for example, there was more fried food for breakfast, and a lot of the things that I'd find in a Chinese hotel for breakfast.
To be honest, I'll be honest, like our breakfast was horrible in Pyongyang, and that Yanggakdo hotel, it was very limited. It was one little omelette, and like we didn't have a buffet, we just had like, each of us was given one little omelette, bread, like white bread and butter, and a cabbage salad, very, very small portions, and then 1 cup of coffee, the instant coffee also, which was not the best. So, yeah, that was a big disappointment. I guess, well, I'm in Pyongyang, I'm not Korea. But other than that, all meals were very good, and in Rason, especially in the hotel there, they had abundant kind of buffet, Chinese-style buffet. And I think this is where they cater more for the Chinese tourists, because a lot of tourists are coming actually to Rason, because they also have the casino there. It's one of the very few casinos. I know they have another in Pyongyang actually. The Yanggakdo hotel has another casino supposedly, but this is where a lot of Chinese are going actually to play in that casino, like in Rason. So they cater for the Chinese tourists there a lot. So it's fried yams, but it was delicious, like a lot of fish and seafood and like a lot of starch. So it was very abundant as well. And like, why would you want to come back? Actually, it was my own feeling. Well, it was a strange feeling. At the first place, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to leave, and like we were kind of also, this is a long story, but like we were drilled that there would be very harsh control at the border between North Korea and Russia, because they will be very harsh in terms of what you could take out of North Korea. Like they wouldn't let us take any information out, so like all my pictures I hid like on the kind of special app. I archived all my pictures, and like we were told like our Western tourist agency was telling us hide your memory cards so that they don't find them. Like they're gonna go through everything. They're not gonna let anything out. They didn't at the end, which was another surprising story, but it's a long story to tell. So at the end, they didn't search us at all, which was amazing, thanks to our guides, also from our Western tourist company. And so on one hand, we all were happy to live. Like we were like, yeah, freedom, free world. We left North Korea. We were like, in Russia is already free world for us. So it was one reaction. But my second reaction was I didn't want to leave, because you somehow develop so intense relationship with the North Korean people, just knowing you know everything about them, and coming from the outside world, and like understanding from your point of view and from your perspective where you are and where they are at the same time, seeing them, and even like those very short friendship with our guides and people we talk to, because we were allowed to communicate and talk to the people, and you really understand that people are so nice, and they may be their naivete and their ingenuity and them not being kind of spoiled in a way, living and struggling and trying to survive within this like horrible system. You feel for them very strongly, and you just really develop, I don't know, I developed very strong kind of personal attachment, and I was like, if I only could stay longer and do something for them or get some kind of involvement, and it's something kind of which goes beyond you. And I know that many people actually have this reaction, so many people keep coming back, and this is, for instance, the motto which the agency I went with operates, not justifying, but because like people blaming them, like, and people blame this kind of tourism, like, why do you do this? Like, why do you spend money? Because then the money goes to state companies and ultimately partially to the regime. Like, why do you keep bringing tourists to North Korea? And like the company I went with, Koryo Tours, they say, well, I mean, that's the only opportunity to allow such exchange taking place, like human exchange where you can go and you can spend time with the North Korean people, and you can change their perception about the world through all of that. And like that was my strongest reaction. And I thought, maybe I could do research at the Kim Il-sung University, or like if I only could stay a couple of months more and like kind of feel it, more intensely. So it's weird, but it happens. And there are some people who maybe would like to come back, but there are a lot of people who want, and I think that's the strongest thing. Yeah. Thank you. So
I was given permission to ask one history question.
yes.
So, in 1956, and my students are all looking at me and smiling because I do a lot of work on 56. But North Korea took steps to minimize, to the extent possible, the influence of the Soviet Union and China on the trajectory of political, economic, and cultural developments in North Korea. This came in the wake of the events of August and September of '56 and the intervention by Anastas Mikoyan and Peng Dehuai. I have a piece that just came out in Cold War history last week on this, if anyone is interested, where I really challenge the narrative. But so from this period, you have this massive purge of ethnic Koreans who had come from the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then you have, I think it was in the 70s and 80s, the person who was actually the ambassador to Moscow in '56, a guy called Lee Sang-jo. He starts this campaign to actually go around to a lot of the people who actually fled back to the Soviet Union, or the families of those who were purged or didn't make it back, and got these people to write their memoirs, short memoirs, just about their time in North Korea. But what I'm curious about is I guess the sentiment among most of the Koryo-saram is there, given this unfortunate history with North Korea, is there greater? I mean, but the fact is there was, it was still a Soviet state, and North Korea technically was still an ally. Was there more affinity toward Pyongyang or Seoul? And how has that changed in recent years with North Korea's behavior?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. Okay. So I'll try to be able to answer it in the remaining time we have. I just very briefly show, because we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but this is also something I try to do from the people's kind of memories and kind of more personal. So this is my original project, Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, which is like a big project on the kind of whole history of that Koryo-saram diaspora. In the third part, so if you're interested kind of to look at it from the Koryo-saram perspective and kind of personal people's stories, so in the third part, it's all online. It's the story of how my major character's uncle reached the position of Deputy Minister of Defense in North Korea. And what happened with him is his son. So that's the only remaining photograph they have. And it's about that purge. It's the former head of the Soviet fraction of the Workers' Communist Party, if I'm not mistaken, HKI. Okay. And just an example of how they were purged, the purge you've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And the story is about a different person. It's a like one of Deputy Minister of Defense, and that's the uncle of my major character. So he tells what happened to him in detail. So that's something I did on that part. So to all interested, I'll be very happy to give the links. And then to that story. And then this is something also we did with the Diplomat, because I've been publishing all my projects, related projects in the Diplomat, is the story of Nam Il, who also was purged as part of that purge. He was purged later.
Much later, no, not in '56, but
he was in the late 60s, early 70s. He was the only one, pretty much, who survived through that whole purge.
But what's fascinating is the North Koreans today still refer to him as Namir Janggunim. They still refer. They call him General
General.
General
yeah.
Namil. So
Yeah.
which you know, the only other person that they use this for is, you know, for Kim Il Sung, you know,
Yeah.
General Kim Il Sung.
Yeah.
But there is still a lot of respect for Namil, despite him being purged later.
Yeah, he was the one who signed the armistice technically, and then he gave it to Kim Il Sung basically. I'm looking for the picture where he's giving it to Kim Il Sung, so to sign. So he's like technically the person who kind of stopped the armed conflict between the two Koreas, right? Like
He and Lee Sang-jo, the guy who actually became the ambassador to Moscow, were the primary negotiators on the North Korean side in Panmunjom.
Yeah, exactly.
The armistice talks.
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then, as you mentioned, that after that, like August incident in 1956, the purges started, and the Soviet fraction was actually, and the Chinese fraction. I mean, there were like 4 fractions, right, in the Workers' Party, in the North Korean Workers' Party back then, and Soviet fraction, Chinese fraction, domestic fraction, and guerrilla fraction. Led by Kim Il Sung, and that's where he comes from with his kind of guerrilla apparatus and surrounding. And basically, after the events you mentioned in the 1956 and later on with the death of Stalin and Khrushchev coming to power in the Soviet Union, the famous or infamous 20th Communist Party Congress, and where he gives the famous speech basically trying to deny the whole personality cult of Stalin, so the Soviet Union had been under before, which was very dear to Kim Il Sung's heart. And this is actually part of the system. Like he personally built his personality cult based on Stalin's personality cult, and that infamous basically breach of trust and between Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. So this is when North Korea stays on its own, starts developing the Juche ideology and implementing political system, parts with the Soviet Union, parts with China, purges the 2 fractions within the Workers' Party, the Yan'an Chinese fraction and the Soviet fraction, and this is when those Koreans start being purged. So they were, I mean, this is the strongest connection also my idea was to talk about during this presentation, because the Soviet Union was supporting North Korea throughout the end of the Second World War, and between the end of the Second World War in 1945 and the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, so throughout 1945 and 48, especially until the early 50s, it kept part of it military, part of it army and military in North Korea, both Russian and Korean. And then since 1948 and throughout the whole Korean War, they brought kind of semi-secretly between, which I'm sure you're very aware about, between 400 and 600 Soviet Koreans to work in North Korea, state, like civil, public sectors, and military. And the amazing story about Nam Il is that he was not a military person. Like you mentioned, that he's very well respected as a general. Right. He didn't even have a military education before he came to North Korea. He was like a kind of a bureaucrat, Soviet bureaucrat, and a teacher. So his family, he's from Uzbekistan. This is basically, I did that story about his personal kind of backgrounds, because he's that Uzbek Korean, or Soviet Uzbek Korean. His whole family was deported to Uzbekistan, and he worked as a teacher in the his middle school in Samarkand, in one of our cities. He was brought to North Korea as part of that 400, 600 Koreans movement. They were chosen by the Communist Party at each level, locally in the Soviet Union. And he was actually like also a bureaucrat and Kim Il-sung's translator, personal translator for a long time. And then he climbed the ranks and entered the military, and like he's like kind of...
And became foreign minister?
Yeah, foreign minister, and then negotiated at the United Nations, what was it, I don't know, session when they were trying to put the end to the Korean War, like in 1953, that infamous UN.
Well, you had the
panel.
or 54, the Geneva.
The Geneva,
talks,
54. So he was there at the Geneva talks and with Zhou Enlai. So really, it's amazing. He was probably after the leaders, like one of the most strikingly famous person in North Korea, still well known. I know his granddaughter in Tashkent. I didn't include it in the presentation, but I have like a selfie with her. Like I saw her last year. She plays kayagum, the Korean music instrument. She's a singer, and she kind of runs her own kind of music band. And it's true what you mentioned, that they kept in touch. Because, they purged many people. And talking about those notes, this is something I wanted to do for a long time. In the Library of Congress, there is this collection of 80 biographies of all these highest leaders of Soviet Korean origin within the North Korean government at that time, and like what happened to them. So like they were purged. So many people were purged, killed, or sent to the gulags in North Korea. Other people were able, those pretty much who had kept the Soviet citizenships, because they were actually made to renounce their Soviet citizenships, but not all of them did. So those with the Soviet citizenships could kind of return to the Soviet Union. And in the 80s, indeed, why in the 80s? Because this is when they have, under Gorbachev, basically the perestroika starts, and they kind of have the freedom of speech, and for the ethnic minorities it's the freedom of their self-determination, because before that they couldn't. And that's another part of our long history of this like Soviet Korean diaspora. They were not allowed kind of to be considered Koreans and to promote their culture. In the 80s, this is when they actually start promoting their culture, and this is what I had in the PPT very briefly. Because your main question was about the time. So this is the whole story of that person. But this is when they start promoting their culture. So, and in the 80s, and these, like, they basically, they're allowed to start feeling the Koreanness, learn the language, use the costumes, and kind of do all kinds of things Korean. And this is when North Korea goes back pretty much to the Soviet Union, kind of trying to grasp those Koreans back. And this is, until most recently, there were actually exchanges between our Koreans in Central Asia and North Korea. And this is when they went to, this was like a music festival in the early 2000s, like a world music festival, international music festival in Pyongyang. Like our Koreans, they're all from Uzbekistan, they came to perform there. So they not only came, basically, they kept the connection with the families of those like in the elite or in that hierarchy who had survived or went back to the Soviet Union. The granddaughter of Nam Il, she went back, she studied at the Kim Il-sung University. So, and it's his first family, because he had the second family in North Korea. He remarried. But his first family, they stayed in Uzbekistan. And his granddaughter, she speaks Korean fluently. She actually went to North Korea many times. She studied in North Korea. Until very recently, we had the embassy. Like Uzbekistan was one of those very few countries we had the DPRK embassy. They closed it. Not for political, but for economic purposes, because like they didn't have money. But like she knew people from the embassy, so they kept throughout all of this time, and until even like most recently. So, but then also, like on all the kind of regular levels, they tried, because also the other part of your question was like, was it Pyongyang or Seoul? Basically, now it's South Korea mostly, Seoul, because. Before that, in the 80s, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, like those places where most of Korean lives, in Central Asia, they were still part of the Soviet Union. And what you mentioned about the Soviet connection, I mean, they were all Soviet states, and kind of North Korea was also kind of bigger and richer brother for them. So they could afford giving them classes, paying language exchanges, and like music and kind of cultural exchanges. And they actually, North Korea brought back the Korean culture to our Koreans. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the collapse of economy in North Korea, and like the reestablishment of the diplomatic relationship with South Korea, of course, slowly South Korea took the role it holds now. And now it's mostly South Korea, of course, because South Korea really promotes the exchange with the minorities, the support of the minorities through all kinds of organizations and like language courses and like all kinds of NGOs, and they pour a lot of money like to support our Koreans. So the shift has really happened in terms of that. But that's the unique connection of our Koreans with North Korea. I kind of wanted also to mention and to stress and to talk about that. Even though things have been difficult, until most recently there was this kind of intimate connection kept, maybe also for some personal reasons, because they came, those people, they're from the same place basically, and they felt that they were part of the, and they know all about, like they all know about them. Like I was wondering, should I tell them that I have like Korean ancestry and that the work I'm doing, like, is it restrictive? Should I rather not tell them? But I actually ended up telling everyone, and they were like all thrilled, and they were calling me Kim Tong-ji, like Comrade Kim, unlike the rest of the group, because the rest of the group they were calling the first names, like I know Edward, Alex. Me, they were calling Kim Tong-ji, like Comrade Kim. Where are you going? So they kind of showed, I guess, the affinity that we kind of belonged, which I was very proud of, and for like that week, during that week, and they all asked, and they all knew. Like I said, like, do you know that there were these Koreans who left originally, and they knew, but they didn't know anything about like Nam-il, for instance, that he was from Uzbekistan. I was like, he's from my country, and like I know his granddaughter, and they were like, really? So for them it was like the so yeah.
It's fascinating that it's just from the 80s when the Korean population was allowed to really begin to explore its the national identity, Korean identity. Because today, I mean, I can tell you just from the time when I was living in Moscow, studying at Moscow State University, just to see how much the Russian Korean population has begun to really influence Russian culture, just in the form of food, for example.
Yeah.
The markovka.
I'm going to show you.
The
markovka. This is
markovka.
This is our Korean
salads.
food.
Yeah.
They come from North Korea. They come from that part of the world I went to.
And these are among the most popular dishes in Russia today. I mean, every market you have a giant Korea stall.
Yeah. And this is part of our cuisine. Like Korean cuisine somehow became part of Russian cuisine, of Uzbek cuisine, of Kazakh cuisine, and Koreans became like, because there are so many. I mean, there was a big migration of at least like 200,000 people who are now like almost 1 million spread throughout the whole country. So and now they're very vocal about, I mean, the existence. So yeah. So
we have to.
This is such a fascinating story.
But if anyone has
definitely have to need extra another session about the history part with the person and Victoria Kim. It's too bad we are running out of time, but thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Great news is actually Victoria Kim, as you can see her appearance, she's expecting
like to finish off very personal.
Fourth generation of Koreans around.
And he traveled with me all the way to North Korea, which I was not even, we were not aware of yet. He did, so he crossed, and he was brewed on North Korean kimchi.
So he'll be born in Washington D.C. And her husband Alexander will be working has been working in World Bank. So both of them and family will be staying here for a while. So we will definitely have her and the family come back here again and again and continue this story.
Yeah. So the third or fourth time I'm coming back telling more. So I'll be happy to continue. We still have a lot of things to discuss, I guess. So thank you so much to everyone for your attention, your time. Yeah, for staying here throughout.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, the whole talk. Thank you for having us here.